Welcome, my friends. Time for Mr. Constitution Hour. This is a program that used to be on two stations in San Diego, AM, FM, KPRZ, and KCBQ, Salem media stations, as a matter of fact. And as time passed, that show, plus the one that I had in Riverside County, and a show that actually touched parts of the entire country with stations, has all come to an end. I am no longer on AM, FM radio after 15 years of radio broadcasting. So I decided, why not take these programs and move them to Rumble and YouTube. So for those of you who are visiting my videos, you're like, wow, this guy has some long videos. I'm a radio guy. That's what I do. That does not mean that I have ideas for shorter videos, and I have been planning for a very long time to start producing shorter videos, and they may start popping up. So visit this page often. Matter of fact, here's what you do. Hit subscribe or follow or whatever the button is that's available to you. And I think on YouTube there's a little bell to be notified. I can't remember if Rumble has a notification little thing. Whatever it is, do what you can to make sure that you pay a visit to these pages every once in a while. But be aware that the live programs, consistently live programs, every Thursday at 3, except on occasions, I'll talk about that in a minute, right here, I am on the air with Mr. Constitution Hour, and then on Saturdays from 1 to 3, and these times are Pacific, by the way, 1 to 3, I will perform Mr. Constitution Hour, which is a show that I on KMET 1490 AM in Southern California every week that's the show that went 15 years. Alan Myers, Dennis Jackson normally joins me. Didn't last Saturday. It happens. But you can also join us on Saturday, 1 to 3, right here as well. And then I am on Patriots Soapbox. Look it up, or you can go to DouglasVGibbs.com, hit DouglasVGibbs.com/radio if you want all the promos for each of the shows every time they're coming up. And go to the /video page or hit the video link at DouglasVGibbs.com if you want to see the past videos. And you can also go to Patriot Soapbox and watch me live there, Fridays 2 to 4 Pacific with my wife, actually. And then on Sundays with Alan Myers. And then we got a few other projects that go on. Tuesdays at 3 with my good friend Ron on his channel, Untold History. Once again, you can go to DouglasVGibbs.com for all this stuff. And then, of course, War Hamster on Wednesdays. That's the only one we pre-record. We don't do it live. And right now we are going through Madison's notes regarding the United States Constitution. So that said, now that I've introduced what this is, once again, the radio program I used to have in San Diego County, Mr. Constitution Hour, every week. We decided to move it to online. And Mel, good to see you in the chat room. Mel is a follower that views the Tuesday program particularly, and he has joined us from halfway around the country, actually past halfway around the country. And I appreciate you, sir. I've had an opportunity to meet with him one time and had lunch with him when I was in the area. It was fantastic. My wife and I still talk about how much fun that was with him and another individual, Ed. And so there's a lot to talk about, as always. And it seems like with the rise of the Democratic Socialist of America, there's even more to talk about. Now, this idea of ideology, leftism, socialism, communism, Hamiltonianism, progressive, whatever you want to call it, they all stem from the same tree. They're all branches on the same tree. The trunk, the main tree, is the same thing. It is larger, more centralized, consolidated government. I don't care what you consider yourself, what label you give yourself. Independent, libertarian, conservative, Republican, constitutionalist, whatever it might be. It really the labels really don't mean a whole lot. It really comes down to collectivism versus individualism. And that big tree, the collectivist, leftist, more consolidated government, less individualism, less freedom, that all is on that same tree. That's what I stand against. I am a Christian first. I am a constitutionalist second. But when I say constitutionalist, I am talking about not collectivism. Instead, someone who recognizes the importance of the individualism, the constitutional republic, the free market that we were given. Because what that leftism does, what that that tree we were talking about a moment ago does in order to achieve its aims, to achieve its ends, is it follows different levels of government controlling the means of production. Even the moderate Democrats follow that recipe book a little bit. Well, we need to have at least some regulations. And I'm not going to deny that there should be some. I'm not an anarchist. I don't believe there should be no regulations, no law, and let everything just go nuts. That would be far right. Something that, by the way, my opposition says I am guilty of. I absolutely believe that government exists for a reason. It is a necessary evil. And once it exists, then we're going to have ideologies, ideas, positions, political ideas, all emerge out of that. Now, when the founding fathers created this country, they followed a design offered by Montesquieu in the Spirit of the Law, which was or Spirit of the Laws, I think it's the plural, which was a book that he wrote that looked at, it was political philosophy. It looked at politics, it looked at government, and it drew from a lot of sources, Polybius being one of them. Polybius was a Greek political philosopher who believed that the lawgiver should not be the lawmaker should not be the lawgiver. And you know, it's funny because I asked AI that one time and it freaked out on that, not because it's leftist, but because from its point of view, government is the lawgiver and the lawmaker. So if government can't be both, the government can't exist. And that's not what I meant. Law-giving, lawmaking all comes from government. But at the same time, you don't want those parts of government colluding with each other and being tyrannical. So you have to find separation inside the same unit, government. It's called the separation of powers. That's what Montesquieu was talking about. That's what Polybius was talking about. Polybius wound up being captured by the Romans when the Roman Empire finally was able to bring down the Greeks and pull them into the Roman umbrella. And he was actually excited about it because he admired the Roman Republic. He admired some of the Roman innovations in politics and in governance, in being a republic rather than a pure democracy like Greece had suffered under so much. And you know, there's people like Solon who, you know, understood that without law there is no freedom. So you have to have law, but you got to put in mechanisms to keep the law from becoming too much, too powerful, encroaching on the rights of the people. And the idea of natural rights at that point with Polybius and the Romans didn't necessarily exist in the way we look at it, but they sort of did. And then you have the Saxons, who were the barbarians to the north, and they believed in God-given rights, that rights come from a creator. They didn't necessarily believe in the Christian or Jewish creator. They were pagans, but they believed that there was some type of divine dispensation of rights. Then you got Mosaic law, the Bible, which also, without saying it directly, believe that what we have, given to us from God, we possess. They are our possession. If you have government control of the means of production, then there can be no possession. And if there can be no possession, then that creates a problem too. And so these ideologies are all swirling around. And so when Montesquieu was writing, and when the founding fathers were reading his writings and developing what would become the United States government, the federal government, they took all of this in. And once again, I want to real quick side note, say thanks to Mel for not only being there, but also posting something in the chat. When you post something in the chat, it gives something to the algorithm. The more posting in the chat, the more comments down below, the more thumbs ups you give my episodes, the more subscriptions, the more following, all of that influences the algorithm. So while I grew quite a bit on AM/FM radio, at minimum I had 20,000 listeners. I believe the numbers were much higher in certain aspects. We are rebuilding now that we're all online. And so, of course, would appreciate if you hit those buttons, post in the on the chat room, post in comments, all that. Okay, get back to what I was talking about. So founding fathers have created these three branches, but yet there has to be a separation. Government has to be able to make law. Government has to be able to execute law. Government has to be able to apply law. But at the same time, if you allow the same entity all that power, it becomes tyrannical. But you can't have three different governments. But you can have three different branches in government. And that's the point. And Mel says, seems all governments over time have had a few good points, but the bad points seem to be more prevalent the past several decades. Well, and Mel, I'm glad you brought that up in the chat. And I do try to respond to the chat. I pay attention to the chat, both in Rumble. I have both Rumble and YouTube up. So if you put some of the chat room on either platform, I'm going to see it. That's what the founding fathers believed. They were like you. They were like, hey, man, a lot of these governments have good ideas and a lot of bad ideas. And not all of the founding fathers necessarily agreed on everything. I mean, as we go through Madison's notes on the Constitutional Convention in 1787 on Warhamster's channel, you know, we're recognizing, and reading Madison's notes are important because they're the James Madison took the best notes during the convention. You know, there was not a lot of agreement. There was some interesting ideas that were really outside the pale. But the founding fathers, what they tried to do is they worked together. They tried to compromise. They tried to come to agreement on what was best for our system. And here's the thing. What's best for our system might not be best for another culture. We had states. Hello, Dave. We had states developing from the colonies. They each have their individual identity. They both are, they all are in many ways sovereign from each, have their own uniqueness about each, about each of them. And yet they came together in a union as one country. So our system needed to, number one, apply with that in mind. Number two, it was designed to try to keep tyranny at bay the best they could with that system. So when we hear about these politicians and we're going to spread democracy, first of all, we don't have a democratic, well, it wasn't designed to be democratic. It's becoming more of a democracy with each passing year, but it was designed for us. So if you try to put what we have or something similar into this culture or that culture, it might not work. Maybe someday if they mature and go through their own whatever, then maybe they'll be able to have something like that. So our system is very unique for a reason, because the development of this country was unique. And omnidirectional is here. Thank you for being here, and thank you for posting in the chat. Once again, the more you chat, the more you comment, the more you push, thumbs ups and things like that. It helps with the algorithm so that we can build this show as big as it was on AM/FM radio before. Once again, my radio programming probably reached at least 20,000 people. Right now, we're not quite there here. Let's get it there. All right, so out of this, what you get is these different ideologies, these different ideas, and you have these different branches that are supposed to have, once again, we understand that you don't want the lawgiver and the lawmaker to be the same entity, but yet it all comes from government. So how do you create separation inside the same entity? This is what the founding fathers were wrestling with. Omnidirectional, I appreciate you covering my back. Got my 6, right? Okay. Of course, that's been overused so much now it's almost cliche.
We used it at my work.
You used it at your work even? Oh, man. Yeah. So it's all the Navy SEALs' fault, probably. But anyway, I'm joking, of course. So anyway, get back to the point here. So founding fathers like, okay, so government is dangerous, but it's necessary. If they do everything, it becomes tyranny, but you can't have 3 separate governments for the 3 parts of the responsibilities of government. So what do? You create 3 branches, but you create separation of powers. So only Congress, the legislative branch, can legislate, make law, modify law, repeal law. Only the executive branch can execute the law, and only the judicial branch can apply the law. That was the design. There will be, because they are part of the same government, some interaction. They have to. It's going to happen. And some of them are going to be checks against the other. And then you have something even broader, because you have a federal government, you have state governments, and you have we the people and our local governments. They also need to be separate, but influencing each other and in some ways checking each other. Because one of the things that the founding fathers understood is if you get too much power in one place, it becomes tyrannical every time. And so they had to distribute the power in such a way that no part of government, that's the reason why we're not a democracy. Because if the people have too much power, it's dangerous. That's why we're not a monarchy. If the executive has too much power, it's dangerous. That's why we're not a legislative dictatorship where the Congress has all the power. And they wanted the separation of power. So, I mean, history shows that more often than not, the president or the executive or something is a part of the legislature. In a British parliament, prime minister is a part of the legislature. In the Roman system, the consuls, which were the executive branch, and there was a couple of them to even divide that power, were a part of the Senate. So the founding fathers said, well, let's take it a step further. Let's remove, and even in our own early government, under the Articles of Confederation, the president wasn't an independent executive. He was the highest ranking legislator in the one house Congress. So the founding fathers, while they were creating this during the Constitutional Convention, said, hey, let's go a little further. Let's take that executive and make him completely independent from the other branches, operating on his own. He has his own. So wait a second, that's dangerous. You have this one guy, he's have all this power. Well, no. We're going to limit what he can do. He can only apply the laws. Because see, the problem with monarchs is they went, I should not apply the law. I'm sorry, execute the law. And when it came to monarchs, they would execute the law, and they got to the point where they were creating their own law, and then they would, pressure the parliament, and then they get their allies in the parliament, and then they got the courts, in their back pocket, and rubber becomes a rubber stamp, and it became a problem. We are going to allow that one person because we realize if you have multiple persons, too many chiefs and not enough Indians kind of thing, right? If this was Gutfield right now, a screen would suddenly pop up there. A racist would say, but that's the saying. It comes from my childhood, and it makes all the sense in the world. But the idea is you got to have a unitary executive, but you don't want him to have access to the power of making law, modifying law, repealing law, applying the law like the courts do. Make him independent, but only allowed to do his function, to perform his function, should I say. Then you got this legislature, which is more powerful in the sense they're making a law, but they can't execute it. Remember what we said about Polybius, right? The lawmakers should not be the lawgivers. The lawgivers should not be the lawmakers. So you separate them. They have to be in the same system, same government. You don't want three different governments competing for position. So it's one government, but different parts of government who have different responsibilities. And then the courts are beyond that. And then when you come to the members of the legislature and the executive, they're going to be political. They're going to believe in what they believe. And so you've got the different factions. And then the founding fathers understood ideology. They understood political parties even before the political parties existed. In Federalist 10, James Madison spends a lot of time talking about factions, how dangerous factions were, and that the best way to control the factions was to set them against each other. And to do that, you have to make the minority factions have a greater voice. Give them a greater voice so that they can compete with the larger factions. Because, see, the larger factions exist more often than not because of democracy, population centers, or wealth and power. So you take those that are smaller population, not so much wealth and power, your rural areas, for example, and you give them a greater voice. so that they can compete against the wealth and power, compete against the population centers, and so that that clash then forces compromise. It forces debate. I love debate. Unlike the Democratic Socialists of America, Democrats, communists, and all of their other ilk, I love a difference of opinion, because if there's a difference of opinion, it does two things. A, in a political process, it usually tempers what you wind up getting out of the system. So it's not so radical because you've got different forces fighting for their position, and it tempers it. And secondly, it sharpens the knives, so to speak, of each fact. I become a better debater and understand what I believe better after going at it with someone who disagrees with me. Because A, I got to defend my position. And B, often I have to defend my position against accusations and things said that I may have not come across before. And so it's all good. Now, I don't want something so extreme that wants to destroy America. This is the reason. So it's not that, for example, constitutionalists and conservatives and Republicans and MAGA and whoever else you want to put into that mix wants to totally eliminate the left. That's why we're so against what's going on. I love debate, but I want debate with someone who's reasonable. Democrats used to be at least kind of reasonable. They've always been, from day one, purveyors of pure democracy and ultimately greater centralized control. Be it King Andrew Jackson, really the founder of the Democratic Party, even though technically the Democratic Party used to be Jeffersonian Republicans. That's a whole different story for another time. To the rise of a federal supremacy push through the Lincolnian Republicans, which was actually the Republican Party, but the Democrats learned from it and gained power from it. The Democrats, actually at that time, a lot of them, the Southern Democrats, were actually more about states' rights and all that. They had that part right. They had other parts wrong. You get into, the Fabians and the progressive era, and you have all of this movement until finally the envelope got pushed so far it's at the edge of the table. And you've got these democratic socialists. But in the process of getting there, ideology developed, and there isn't just two ideologies. And we get caught up on this Republican versus Democrat, right versus left, red versus blue. And then my friend Wolfram says, well, it doesn't exist. Well, it's not that it doesn't exist. It does exist. But it's more complex than what sometimes it's made out to be. There is collectivism versus individualism, and then there are certain variations in between. What typically happens historically is the extremes wind up becoming the most powerful factions within that argument. And the extremes are the danger. The extreme of no government becoming anarchy, which winds up becoming totalitarian dictatorship, centralized power, and the extreme of the far left, which is total power and eliminating individualism, eliminating ownership, eliminating your natural rights, because they belong to government. It's up to government to dictate them, define them, and distribute them. All of that is at risk with the extremes. The Constitution's dead center. It is the ultimate moderation of ideology. Then there's going to be those who believe it didn't go far enough in the supremacy of government. Others say it went too far, and so on and so forth. And then you get your different individual, independent, in between ideologies. But the founding fathers were well aware of ideology. And so when they created this system, tempering ideology and stopping the extremes was the goal. That was the whole design. And please don't. I get into these arguments all the time with certain individuals. Well, communism is new. Socialism is new. Karl Marx wasn't even born yet. There was nothing new about that ideology. He just rehashed something that already existed and called it a different name. If you read the writings of the Founding Fathers, they were well aware of the redistribution of wealth. They called it the schemes of leveling. They were well aware of socialism, but they call it communitarianism, utopianism. They were well aware of this kind of thinking because it existed. And it was bubbling like crazy thanks to the Jacobins in France at that moment. And so they were well aware of this stuff. And so when they designed the system, it was to combat that. So you got your president to execute the law. You got your legislature to apply. I'm sorry, to keep wanting to say apply, to create, modify, and repeal law. And then you got the courts to apply the law. They're supposed to take the law and apply it to whatever rulings they get. Now, their job is not supposed to be ideological. We expect the president and the legislators to belong to an ideology and let that ideology kind of drive what they say or do. That's just the reality. It's going to happen. And I mean, during George Washington's presidency, the Federalist Party under Alexander Hamilton, and there was nothing Federalist about it, by the way, it should have been called the Nationalist Party, as in nationalism, as in the government controlling everything. And the Republican Party under the Jeffersons, which later became the Democratic Party. It's not the original Republican Party, but Jeffersonian ideas of laissez-faire, limited government, how it wound up becoming ultimately the Democratic Party is an interesting story, and it's really the opposite of what it started as. But these emerged early on. They were already there early on in the very first presidency. The founding fathers knew these things. I don't know if they knew that the political parties would pop up, but they knew that factions existed. These ideologies were there. They designed the system to protect against it. They knew that the legislators were going to be ideological. They knew the president was going to be, but they didn't want the judges to be, because the judge's job is not ideology. The job of the judges is to apply the law or apply the Constitution as it is written. And what they saw in Britain, the problem in Britain was English common law. And I love when people start throwing common law at me and say, well, Doug, what about common law? What does common law say? Blah, blah, blah. Understand something. British common law, English common law, was one of the driving forces behind the writing of the Constitution. The founding fathers recognized certain advantages from common law, but for the most part, they were trying to get away from common law. Because common law was the law of the people, which can be good, but it changed with the whims of society, the whims of culture, and the rulings of the courts. It was a living, breathing mechanism. So in order to make sure our system was not a living, breathing mechanism like English common law, they wrote the Constitution. See, the British Constitution wasn't written. Parts of it wound up coming from documents. But overall, the British Constitution was not, the English Constitution was not written. It drew from the Magna Carta, it drew from the Declaration of Rights, but for the most part, it was based on common law. And once again, common law, living, breathing mechanism. It changed with the whims of society. If society decided that what was legal yesterday should be not legal today, then that was the case. If the judges decided what wasn't legal yesterday should be legal today, they ruled that way, and that's what it became. And so it was fluctuating and changing constantly. There were some basic foundations of common law that we do draw a lot from, but our system is not completely based on English common law, and English common law does not determine what we became completely. So when I was watching this, case in the Supreme Court regarding birthright citizenship, for example, and they drew from common law a lot, and John Roberts quoted from common law. It's, well, wait a second. Common law has nothing to do with that. There is some historical influences that they drew from. Some of it was common law, natural born subject. Some of it was the writings of people like Montesquieu. Some of it was writings from other philosophers and the realities of other republics and the Saxon heritage of the British system. All of that was important, but our system, you cannot say our system comes from common law, English common law. It doesn't. And like I said, for the most part, it was designed to go against common law. And, and we tend to look at things in a binary sense. We tend to draw these conclusions. It's either this or it's that. More often than not, it's a combination. It's a blending. It's a little bit of both, or it's a little bit of neither. Like the old saying goes, there's all the truth of the story is not always what he said, she said. It's usually what happened in between. And so we have to, understand that when we examine our laws, we examine history, we examine the Constitution. And so now, get back to the United States Supreme Court. So their job is to apply the law and apply the Constitution without ideological influence. They're supposed to be what we call apolitical. The Lady Justice, which is actually based on a goddess, but that's fine. There's a lot of symbology that we use. Statue of Liberty comes from pagan goddesses and things like that. That doesn't mean we shoot it all down, but be aware that does exist. But Lady Justice, when you look at that statue, that image, right? And she's got the scales in one hand and the sword in the other. And she's blindfolded. The sword and the scales of justice, right? They're both powerful part of it. But in the end, she's blindfolded. She doesn't see ideology. She doesn't see the different factions. Her job is not to see those things. She's blind to all those things. All she sees is the law. What does the law say? Well, it's been interpreted to mean that's not her job. Her job is not to interpret it. Her job is not to go by what somebody else interpreted it as meaning. What does it say? Now, this is the reason why statutory law tends to be so thick, so long, because the idea is you've got to guard against misinterpretation. It has to mean what it says, and so you make sure that it is, and some of these laws, they wind up, a stack of papers that's high enough for you to sit on as a stool. And that's good and it's bad. If you've got to use that much language, the law is probably more complex than it should be. But at the same time, when it comes to something like the Constitution, which is this, itty bitty little booklet, look how easily they've misinterpreted it and played with it and usurped it and bent it and twisted it and everything else. Because unlike statutory law, it's concise, precise, and says what it says, but it's all kinds of interpretations. That is not the job of the courts. The job of the court is to apply the law and to only see the law. There's a blindfolder. All that matters is the law, be it the Constitution of the United States or statutory law. That is their job. That's it. They're blind to everything else. And so now we've got the United States Supreme Court with this new slate of rulings recently in June. You saw all these rulings suddenly come down, right? Before they take a break. And if you read these rulings and the opinions, all the Supreme Court did for me was reveal how far they've strayed from the United States Constitution. I'm not necessarily referring to their rulings in particular, but the fact that they are operating in the manner that they are. The judicial branch was designed by the Constitution to be the weakest of the three branches. This flies in the face of this idea, and I'm sure you heard this as a kid. You had this pounding in the skull, the three co-equal branches. We don't have we're not supposed to have three co-equal branches. They are different from each other. They have different responsibilities. Some have more or less and different and everything else. There is no co-equal about it. So, well, Doug, we mean by amount of power, so the one can't stand it. No, even then, for the most part, Congress is more powerful. They can override a veto. Through the exceptions clause, they can override judicial opinion and judicial rulings. But then we can throw the bums out. So we have also a very powerful sword in the fight. President can't veto, and if they don't have enough votes, he gets his way. The executive branch has as the vice president in the Senate as a deciding vote. So when there's a tie. So there's there are these different advantages different branches have, but they're not co-equal. And then the courts have this thing called judicial review. That's unconstitutional. Interpreting the Constitution and federal law in the manner that the federal courts do is unconstitutional. Striking down laws, executive orders with their rulings, that's unconstitutional. They don't have that authority enumerated in the Constitution. And I know that this constitutional perspective that I'm tossing at you regarding judicial review and the current state of the United States Supreme Court must seem confusing to some of you. Some of you get it. You've been around me long enough. Mel in the chat room says, it seems lately the judicial side has removed the mask or removed the blindfold when making a ruling. Absolutely, they have. And what they're doing when they remove that blindfold is they're acting in an unconstitutional manner. And when we hear, well, they're not supposed to interpret, that's hard to swallow. A lot of my research, I have books for. Behind me are books. Most of these books, most of them, not all, but most of the books behind me are 19th century America. Because in addition to a myriad of other things I'm writing, I've got probably 8 books I'm working on all at once right now. The winner gets published first. One of them is part 2 of my U.S. history series that may or may not get done this year. I hope so. I want it done by the end of the year. And so most of these books are resources for that book. I have 4,000 books. And and I get into this and I explain when we get back to the separation of powers and the branches, that when it comes to the judicial branch, they are outside the other branches. They wear that blindfold. They're not supposed to have the power to interpret. They're not supposed to have the power to use their ideology, whatever it might be, for rulings. It's all about the law. It's all about what the Constitution says. And so what we saw from the Supreme Court, and once again, not what their rulings were, but a lot of the discussion here, what it should do is raise for you fundamental questions about the proper role of the judiciary in American governance. So, like I said a moment ago, judicial review is unconstitutional. I don't care how long the legal system has claimed otherwise. The very idea that judicial review is unconstitutional has substantial historical support. The Constitutional Convention rejected proposals for judicial review of legislative acts. James Madison's notes indicate that the framers explicitly considered and rejected granting courts this power. Warhamster's in the house, by the way. Good to see you, buddy. Madison's notes indicate that the framers explicitly considered and rejected granting courts this power. Marbury versus Madison, however, has been used as the mechanism that allegedly codified judicial review into law, even though the courts can't make law. And the supporters of the concept argue that judicial review is created through judicial assertion. No, all legislative powers belong to Congress. All amendments must be ratified by the states. In the case of judicial review, neither legislation nor the amendment process was used to breathe life into it. Chief Justice John Marshall's opinion simply established what he called the essential dignity of the judicial branch, which has nothing more than an innovative, unconstitutional interpretation rather than a clearly enumerated power. So once the courts believed they could wield this power without retribution, the launch of a self-expanding federal government loomed into action. If the federal judiciary can determine the scope of federal power, then the federal government, that is supposed to be limited in its authorities, may also operate as the same entity determining these limits. A clear conflict with the principle of limited government that animated the Constitutional Convention. I talked about this a moment ago, right? You have this one idea from Polybius, the Greek philosopher: the lawmakers must not be the lawgivers, but yet lawmaking and lawgiving must come from government. So the lawmaker and the lawgiver are the same entity. So how do you fix that problem? You create 3 branches that are separate, unique, independent, except for some connections, and we went over that. Separation of powers. That way you get the value of a government that's united, but the benefit that the lawgivers are not the lawmakers and the law appliers are neither of the previous. Separate jobs. But what we have is a federal government who audits itself. We have a government that says, hey, there's questions about our law and constitutionality. Don't worry, we'll decide for ourselves through our court system. Oh, our court said it's okay, so don't worry about it. It's totally constitutional. That's not limited government. And as a result of this, ideology has naturally emerged on the court. And when adherence to original intent is labeled as conservative or partisan, it reveals how far we've strayed from the original constitutional design. And that's what I meant earlier about how far we've come away from the Constitution of the courts. I'm not talking about their decision and the rulings as much as this idea that we have the conservative judges and the leftist judges and this partisan this and, well, you know, where are they, which political side of this one going to stand? How far have we strayed from the original constitutional design? The constitutional job of the justices from an original viewpoint is to apply the law, not interpret it, not review it, not strike it down. Their jobs are simply applying the law as written, not creating policy preferences. The very fact that we can predict how judges will rule based on their supposed ideological leanings demonstrates that constitutional interpretation has become the norm, and in modern politics, it has evolved into policy making. The current situation where we classify justices as leftist or conservative would have horrified the framers of the Constitution. Like I said, ideology, party, all of that was going to happen. We do it naturally. And we kind of expect our representatives and our executives to play that game. But the judges are not supposed to. Article 3 judges were intended to be insulated from politics precisely so they could apply law impartially. Life tenure, in other words, you stay a judge as long as you don't violate the Constitution or break law, as long as you're, a good behavior, was meant to free them from political pressure, not to entrench ideological factions. The distinction between applying versus interpreting the law is crucial. The modern view that the Constitution is a living document that requires creative interpretation has effectively transformed justices into legislators. This judicial activism has accelerated as both political parties have recognized the court as a policy-making body rather than a legal one. In other words, now we have these two powerful parties. So I'd get there, Warhamster. I don't necessarily disagree with you on what you say about the party system in certain ways. I don't think it's as extreme as you think, but he's in the chat. What, folks, you're watching this later and you can't participate in the chat? You don't know what Warhamster said? Watch these live on Thursdays at 3 p.m. Pacific. It's real easy. But anyway, so what we've seen because of the parties realizing they can play this game with the judges now, thanks to judicial review and other things. Now, that this distinction, this modern view that the Constitution is a living document. Remember, I said that's what English law was, common law was, right? Living, breathing mechanism. The whole point of the Constitution was get away from that. Once again, all these people go, well, Doug, what is English common law? John Roberts did that in the birthright case. Well, according to English common law is a minor aspect of the influences of what our system became, and most of it we were trying to get away from. If it's a living document, then it requires creative interpretation, and that has effectively transformed the justices into legislators. And both parties recognize that. They recognize they can use the court as a policy-making body rather than a legal one. So the problem compounds itself. Once judicial review was established, it became inevitable that presidents would nominate justices based on their expected policy outcomes rather than their judicial temperament. This has created the polarization we see in today's courts, and it is very problematic. From a constitutionalist point of view, my perspective, the solution is to return to the framers' vision. Justices who apply the law as written rather than according to their policy preferences. But this would mean recognizing that the Constitution doesn't contain many policy prescriptions. It establishes a structure of government and leaves policy decisions to the political processes, and it distributes power based on separation of powers, the three branches, the states, and so on and so forth. The existence of judicial review and the tension between limited government and judicial review is perhaps the central constitutional paradox of our time. If the federal judiciary can determine the scope of federal power, then limited government becomes whatever the courts say it is, which is no limitation at all. And yet we have now this rise of this socialist leftist deal coming in. These DSA, democratic socialists, they have the word democratic, so it don't sound so bad. Well, we're democratic. We're not supposed to be a democracy. You're still messing it up, guys. Don't trust you. And you've got these fundamental aspects of this rising ideology. And among the fundamental aspects of what it is the distinction about what communists consider personal property versus private property. At the center of the whole, and understand something, socialism, communism is basically an economic system that's all about controlling the means of production. But how do you control the means of production? Through the control of possession and private property. See, the communist critique of private property targets the means of production and any assets that generate wealth or are symbols of wealth. According to Marxist theory, when these means of production, means of wealth generation, or signs of wealth are privately owned, they create a class system where owners, the bourgeoisie, profit from the labor of workers, the proletariat. Communism teaches that private property ownership allows the wealthy to create value through the labor of workers, while the laborers only receive a portion of that value in wages. So, according to Marx, that alienates workers from their labor, dividing them from their humanity. Class struggle. The inequality gap widens, leading to class division, social conflict. So Karl Marx viewed private property as a historical development that served a purpose, but would eventually be superseded by collective ownership as a communist society advances. And as with any system, the envelope is pushed and the dynamics become more extreme. A friend of mine visited Moscow in 1972, and he observed no curtains on any of the windows of the apartments or other living spaces. And when he asked about it, he was told the rule was necessary so that nobody could hide any illegal excess. Soviet Russia argued that any visible displays of any wealth must be discouraged because they represented the capitalist values that communism sought to replace. The absence of curtains also symbolized a rejection of privacy in favor of communal transparency. Remember, in socialist systems, the community's interests outweigh individual desires and concerns. In the end, the no curtains policy made it difficult for individuals to accumulate goods beyond what was considered appropriate for everyone. Any personal property, be it real estate or your possessions, are not allowed. They're looked down upon. And it got to the point in the Soviet Union where they would literally make sure you couldn't have curtains so you couldn't hide your alleged wealth. It's worth noting that party elites enjoyed privileges and possessions unavailable to ordinary citizens. Communism is great for those who are in charge. Communist vision of property relations aims to create a society where the means of production are collectively owned and controlled, eliminating class divisions, allowing for equitable distribution of goods and services based on need rather than purchasing power. That same dynamic never applies to those in charge, as I said a moment ago. Communism's anti-possession principles, this idea of controlling the means of production through owning everything and not allowing the people to own the means of production or own any sign of what, it's flawed for several. The founding fathers recognized, because see, it all comes down to natural rights. Ultimately, private property, ownership, possessions, means of production, it all comes down to natural rights. The founding fathers recognized the importance of our natural rights and the fact that they are among our private and personal possessions. The Declaration of Independence establishes that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. And that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The right to own property is deeply intertwined with those natural rights. When individuals cannot possess the fruits of their labors, their liberty is compromised and their ability to pursue happiness is severely constrained. If one may not possess property, then not only is their pursuit of happiness obstructed, but then that means they can't own their own God-given rights either. If one does not own one's own rights, that means they are possessed by government. Your natural rights then don't belong to you; they belong to government, and government is there to define them and provide them, as they determine. So while property rights begins with the ownership of physical property, and it is considered a natural right, if government may confiscate and possess tangible property, the government will ultimately take possession of all property, including one's personal blessings of liberty. Communist anti-property principles have led to severe historical consequences every time these principles have been applied. Every nation that has implemented anti-property principles has experienced economic disaster. The Soviet Union, Eastern Bloc countries, China through the impact, should I say China, though they did some market reforms that kind of stuck some capitalistic principles into it. So that's the only reason why they extended the life of their system. But even them, Cuba, North Korea, Venezuela, they've all suffered from massive shortages, declining productivity, and technological stagnation, lack of innovation, once private property was abolished. As the founding fathers realized, the ownership of private property is a key foundational necessity for a system to flourish and become prosperous. Ultimately, the elimination of private property leads to massive state power. When the state controls all means of production, distribution, the ownership of property, it gains total control of the lives of its citizens. So my friend's observation of no curtains in Moscow illustrates this. Without property rights, there is no meaningful barrier between the individual and state power. And the consequences of it all includes the deaths of over 100 million people through starvation, purges, labor camps, and direct execution. There's a whole list of the failures of communism, and they claim they aim to protect the environment, and but they have the worst environmental records in human history. They claim they're there for the workers, but the workers become the enemy. Without property rights, the incentive to innovate and improve also disappears. Communist countries historically lag behind capitalist countries in technological advancement, scientific discovery, quality of life improvements. Communist thinking misunderstands human nature. They are convinced, that we have this goodness. I remember this was close to 20 years ago, probably 16, 17 years ago, on my blog at Political Pistachio, and I had this this homosexual leftist government worker named Tom, who used to he hated me so much he even created a website that he called Dougie Watch that was all about me. I mean, the guy I was his project. And one time he responded to me talking about how when you make everything collective, everything drops to the lowest common denominator. If you're very productive and citizen A is very productive, citizen B isn't, and citizen B is receiving from the government the same amount of stuff, what's citizen A going to do? They're going to reduce their production. Why am I working so hard for the same as what dirtbag over there is getting? And he puts in his comments in the comment section of my website, you have a low opinion of the human beings. You just think everybody would be that. Yeah, we all fall short of the glory of God. We're wicked. And natural human nature does that. I don't care who you are. If you're in the same situation and you're working harder than everybody else because you believe in whatever, and everybody else is working less, and you're getting screwed, tattooed, and not getting what you think you deserve. Well, I deserve more. I worked harder. Well, then you don't belong in the society. So what do? You work less. Everything goes down to the lowest common. And he didn't understand how I could see that. Well, communists think they understand human nature. They think that the goodness of people will support their ideology, or that human nature can be reshaped by their ideology. People are motivated by self-interest, family concern, following a moral path laid out by their creator, and a desire to leave a better world for their children. And all of these things are directly or indirectly related to and expressed through acquiring and protecting property. When these natural motivations are suppressed, society doesn't become more egalitarian. Society becomes more brutal, as history has repeatedly demonstrated. The American constitutional system, our U.S. Constitution, by contrast, was designed to secure property rights precisely because the founding fathers understood that ownership creates a natural check on government power and provides the foundation for a free and prosperous society. This is a large part of why the policies being advanced by the Democratic Socialist candidates are so concerning. And it isn't only festering in New York City around Zoran Mamdani. Los Angeles County has this Community Opportunity to Purchase Act. And it's basically government seizure of property, and then they give it to their political allies. And it undermines the whole idea what the Constitution is about, contract clause and eminent domain and so on and so forth. The recent deadly earthquakes in Venezuela revealed the stark reality of the flaws of anti-property principles of communist systems. The buildings constructed under Hugo Chavez's grand housing mission were being held together by styrofoam and concrete shells. And they collapsed in the earthquake. Thousands of people are dead or missing. Tens of thousands of people are dead or missing. This wasn't an accident. It was a predictable result of a system that values politically loyal over competence, central planning over expertise, propaganda over safety. This was expected. What we are seeing in America is the early stage of the same ideological path that led to the collapse of every communist society. These policies are championed as fair, equitable, and reasonable policies for helping the poor and the homeless, but ultimately leads to the erosion of property rights, a concentration of power, a degradation of quality and safety, the creation of a permanent underclass dependent upon government, and the eventual collapse of the economic system. And the founding fathers understood that property rights are not merely about protecting wealth. They're about securing liberty. When the state is able to seize property, it can control your behavior. When the state controls the means of production, it controls your life. This is why the Constitution contains explicit language regarding property rights, and why any attempt to undermine these principles should be viewed as an attack on the very foundations of our republic. Even if used in the name of the common good, history demonstrates that whether it's through outright seizure or through regulatory schemes that effectively transfers property to political allies, the result is the same: the concentration of power in the hands of the few and the erosion of freedom for everyone else. Ultimately, that's always what happens. Now, here I am. I'm at the 1 hour mark. This is a 1 hour show. This used to be a 1 hour show in San Diego AM FM. And I got through two of the things I wanted to talk about tonight. One of the things I did today is I broke down the Democratic Socialists of America platform. I broke it down to 66 wish list items. A lot of them are actually tried and replaced. They've already been tried somewhere in the world or even in America and replaced by the U.S. Constitution. I'll give you an example. Well, we'll get rid of the president, make him a part of the Congress. Well, that's what we had under the Articles of Confederation, and it failed miserably. That's why they created the executive branch. Well, we'll just get rid of the federal courts and Supreme Court. That's what we had under the Articles of Confederation, was only the state courts. But then when issues came up with maritime law or disputes between the states, things like that, we had problems. So they created a federal court. Every one of their platform items has been tried and failed either in American history or somewhere in the world during history. And the Constitution was designed to guard against exactly what these idiots are trying to see. I remember Thomas Sowell once said that if the left understood economics, they wouldn't be socialist. F.A. Hayek, what's the road to right there?
Yes.
Serfdom. I gave that to my wife to read.
Yes, right here.
F.A. Hayek, The Road to Serfdom. Important book to read.
Yeah.
They are teaching anti-possession. They are teaching failed ideas that have already been tried and failed for a reason. They are trying to consolidate the power into one body, and they believe that Congress, the House of Representatives, is that body. Why? Because it's democratically elected. Because they know that democracy is the road to their power. That's why they want to get rid of the courts, get rid of the executive branch, get rid of the Senate. Well, what does that leave? The House of Representatives. How is the House of Representatives populated? Democracy, pure democracy. They know that democracy is the road to their power, their control, their takeover of America. And that's the reason why I get so ticked every time I see these, even allies on TV talking about our democracy. Democracy is the problem. I wrote a book about it, Repeal Democracy. They got all these accusations against Donald Trump about how unconstitutional he is. I wrote a book about that, Constitutional Presidency of Donald J. What, you don't know about that book? Oh, yeah, it's available right now at Amazon. The Constitutional Presidency of Donald J. Trump by Douglas V. Gibbs. Give it a visit. Buy it. Let me know. And then after you buy it from Amazon, give it a rating at Amazon. That'll help the algorithm for that book. Just like you chatting, leaving comments in the comment section, hitting the thumbs up, subscribing, all helps these shows. Remember, I'm a radio guy. I go long. I'm going to hopefully eventually start doing some shorter videos. That's what I do. Mr. Constitution Hour airs unless there's a reason. I never did get into why I wasn't on last week. And I promised I would. So last Wednesday of last week, marked my 2-year anniversary of moving to my new home on the Oregon coast. So we took Wednesday and Thursday off so we could celebrate that. We went up the coast. So that's why I canceled last week's show. But typically, Thursdays at 3 p.m. Pacific, log in, join in, chat, listen, comment. And you can even go to douglasvgibbs.com and hit the Ask Doug link in the link bar. Ask me questions directly. I'll talk about it on the air if you want. I'll write an article about it or something like that. And if you want to help fund what I do, douglasvgibbs.com. Scroll down, hit the donate button, or hit the join link in the link bar to become a $9 a month patron. Helps. I've got a few articles where I go deeper, and only patrons can access them too. So if you want access to my deeper dives on certain stuff, you need to be a patron. $9 a month. That's all it takes. You buy coffee for more daily.
Sure.
All right. Thanks for spending the time with me. United we stand. Combined we kick butt. God bless America, my friends. God bless you. You're awesome. Appreciate you. Thank you for those who chatted in the chat room. We'll see you next time. Stay safe. Stay constitutional. Bye-bye now.